Good afternoon and welcome to This is Revolution podcast. I am the normal co-host, Pascal Robert. I'm the acting host for today. Today we are having a special January 1st episode of This is Revolution podcast. Officially, the Haitians have taken over the podcast for the day. Jason is going to be at home watching, probably with his family. For those of you who do not know, January 1st is Haitian Independence Day. On January 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, after defeating the army of Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Vertières in November of 1803, in January 1st of 1804, declared Haiti an independent nation state. Today, with our guest, Dr. Paul Mocombe, we're going to discuss the overall Haitian Revolution and what exactly was the global impact and importance and significance of that revolution, and perhaps, if time allows, get into a deeper discussion into how the politics immediately after the revolution correlate to the current realities that exist in Haiti. So, with that in consideration, let me give you the bio of our guest. Paul C. Mocombe is a Haitian philosopher and sociologist, a former visiting professor of philosophy and sociology at Bethune Cookman University, assistant professor of philosophy and sociology at West Virginia State University, and the president CEO of the Mocombeian Foundation Incorporated. He is interested in the application of his theories of phenomenological structuralism and consciousness field theory to contemporary issues such as the constitution of consciousness, race, class, and capitalism, and globalization. Dr. Mocombe, who for 10 years argued for the newly found fifth force of nature, which he posits is associated with the consciousness in the multiverse, is the author of many books. The Theory of Phenomenological Sructuralism, Haitian Epistemology, Identity, and Ideology in Haiti, Jesus in the Streets, Race and Class Distinctions Within Black Communities, Language, Literacy, and Pedagogy in Postindustrial Societies, A Labor Approach to the Development of the Self or Modern Personality, The Case of Public Education, Education and Globalization, and Mocombe's Reading Room series, and the Mocombeian Strategy, The Reason for and Answer to Black Failure in Capitalist Education. Dr. Mocombe currently lives in Lauderdale, Florida, with his wife, Tiara S. Mocombe, my good friend for several years. I'd like to introduce you all to Paul C. Mocombe.
Happy Independence Day, brother.
Brother Paul, Ayibobo. Yes,
Ayibobo.
Indeed. Paul, as we know, we were supposed to have our great friend, Dr. Celestine Joseph, join us today. He is not able to make it. Hopefully, his issues are resolved and he is back up to snuff, and we can invite him on another time.
Absolutely.
Paul, you are, I guess it's safe to say, you are a friend of the show. You watch the show regularly, and you have been on at least 2 times before. One time to talk about critical race theory, and one time to talk about Haiti in its class context. So, if you can, for us, Paul, we're going to have this as a dialogue because we both are familiar with the history. Let us bring our audience to pre-revolutionary Haiti and Saint-Domingue, which was called Saint-Domingue.
Yes.
What exactly are the distinctive factors that bring forth the capacity of the Africans on Hispaniola, which the eastern half was the Dominican Republic and the western half was Saint-Domingue, to start this 13-year process starting in 1791, going to 1804, that is now known as the Haitian Revolution? What were some of the distinctive realities that made this particular revolution possible in the context of the identity of all participants, Blacks, Africans, Creoles, mulattoes, whites, petit blanc, grand blanc, you name it?
All right. What I would like to do, how I like to start the discussion is, as though I'm speaking to young Haitian Americans and young Haitians in the diaspora, throughout the diaspora, because one of the issues, and not only young Haitians, and I'm 46, I'm talking about those younger than 46, as well as older Haitians. One of the issues or the misconceptions that we have about the revolution is the fact that it's been presented to us in terms of one of the first classic books, Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, as though it was a revolution that had one purpose in mind, which was to free the slaves who were on the island, who were brought on the island by the French. And this was basically a response to the contradictions of liberalism as practiced by whites. I think that's a misconception, because if you understand the Haitian Revolution within that light, you would have to understand the history of Haiti as unfolding along this line of a more perfect modernity than the ones that the whites tried to implement on the island, which I have a problem with. And many Haitians, especially younger ones coming up in this generation, all they understand about the revolution is the fact that we were free, we were libre, and we were able to do whatever we want to. And all of that comes within this dialectical thinking about liberalism and the liberal humanism of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. That could not be further from the truth, because what we have on the island and this is why, although in my analysis, in my development of sociological theory and philosophical theory, I don't begin with Marx. I have a tendency to more so begin with Weber, and I won't get into the theoretical details why. But Marx is right in the sense that we have to understand the historical material conditions that would give rise to the revolution and the identities that are fighting within the revolution. I think one of the misconceptions that we don't look, because of the need to conceptualize the Haitian Revolution within a black-white dialectic, we fail to realize there are several groups at play within the revolution. And all of these groups, the positions and the interests of every group, were determined by the historical material positions vis-a-vis the mode of production that was introduced on the island. Now, the revolution, the Haitian Revolution, is caught between mercantilism and an emerging capitalism that has not been reified yet as we know it today. Because we have to remember, Adam Smith does not write The Wealth of Nations until 1776. So the Haitian Revolution is only 20 some odd years before the revolution. Adam Smith's right 19 or so years before the revolution that Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations. So what we have to understand is the groups that would emerge on the island of Hispaniola when the revolution commences in 1791 are determined by a mercantilist system in which great powers of the time wanted to have colonies so that they can have agricultural products that they could import, and that they would simply produce industrial production on their side of the island. So what you have is a contradiction between the colonies, which served as raw materials for the core nations, who in turn would produce and sell products from these, or would sell these products and make manufactured goods from these products. So by 1791, the slave trade had been going on for almost 200 years. And we have to remember, every European power at the time was involved in the slave trade, from the Dutch, the English, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, you name it. All of them were involved in the slave trade. The notion was we can use African labor to produce the raw materials in the colonies that each superpower owned, and then export the raw materials to the core nations, and there the core nations would produce manufactured goods from these raw materials, and this is free labor. So what would emerge from that? These colonies, the colonies would be weakened, and the core nations, the metropole, would gain wealth because they didn't have to pay labor. So by 1791, on the island of Hispaniola, what you find is Africans who were imported on the island by the French, and the French, contrary to popular beliefs, the French made no distinctions between the Africans that they imported. It's hard when we write historically, we have a tendency to use grand narratives and grand terms, meta narrative terms to describe. You have to remember, the Africans who were imported on the island did not view themselves as Africans. They viewed themselves by their tribal groups that they came from in Africa. So you had Igbo, you had those from Dahomey, and they did not view themselves as a Black. They did not view themselves as a African. So this notion that we have, it was the Blacks fought and the Africans fought against slavery, that's another misnomer that we have when we try to conceptualize the Haitian Revolution.
Let me interject here because, like I said, we want to make this more of a dialogue because you and I, as we know, there's not a day that we talk. We talk many days when we don't go over Haitian history and Haitian politics and things of that nature. One of the things that I think is very important in clarifying here is that the traditional narrative of the Haitian Revolution being a binary fight between Blacks and whites is an absolute misnomer.
Absolute.
And part of the tragic way in which we view Haitian society is that the nuances and intricacies that make up how the war starts and who fights in the war leads to a misunderstanding of how Haitian society is shaped. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
So to facilitate ease in explaining, and correct me if you think I'm wrong,
go ahead.
You said something that's very important. The super majority of Blacks on the island, some say in excess of 65, 66%, are Africans who were born in Africa, brought to the country. What is significant about this is that in comparison, I'm making a brief comparison here to North America. What distinguishes Saint-Domingue, because that's what it was called in pre-revolutionary Haiti, to the American colonies, is that the Black slaves on the American colonies had more time to reproduce, which caused less of a demand for constant influx of newly arriving slaves.
Absolutely.
So there was a more expanded period of maturation into the system than there would be in pre-revolutionary Haiti or Saint-Domingue, largely because as a product of the climate and the physical brutality and sadistic nature of the French, the life expectancy of these African imports were profoundly short. Some say between 5 to 7 years.
And not only that, Pascal, but the French did not distinguish between the Africans that they introduced or imported into Saint-Domingue, whereas the Americans did. If you read books like Albion Seed and others, or Joseph Holloway, Africanism, the Americans and the British were strategic in the type of Africans that they imported into the colonies. For example, they would import certain Igbo to work in the South, in the Gullah section of South Carolina, for example. Whereas the French did not discriminate. All the French did went into Africa and just rounded up, or they purchased prisoners of war. It did not matter. Whereas the British and the Americans, they were strategic in the type of Africans or tribal areas that they imported from. The French did not make that distinction.
Well, I don't know if it's that they didn't make that distinction. I think they made the distinction much less to the degree.
Yes, absolutely.
Than the British. Because one of the things I know, for example, with the domestic rice production in pre-revolutionary Haiti is a direct consequence of importing Senegambian Africans.
Yes.
On the island, because that is the rice coast.
But the problem that occurred as a result of that, because the Africans at that point were dying en masse because of the brutality of the French system. There came a time where they did not make that discrimination, and so they just started importing slaves and figured that the Creole blacks on the island would subsequently socialize the newly imported Africans into the plantation system. That's what happened. And so as a result of that, they started to import prisoners of war from the Congolese region of Africa. So when you look at the Haitian Revolution, when you look at some of the African revolutionary leaders, and that's the other omitting factor when we look at the Haitian Revolution, many, especially Haitian scholars, omit the African leadership in the revolution. It's not the fact, and this is another grand meta-narrative that is presented when we talk about the revolution. It's as though everybody fought freely and happily under Dessalines, under Toussaint, under Capois. That was not the case. There were, in many instances, because majority of the blacks on the island were directly from Africa, they refused to fight under some of the Creole black leadership.
Yes, we're going to get to that.
Yes, absolutely.
We're going to get to that.
Before we get to that, so what you find, and I love the comparison that you were trying to draw between the American slave system and what we find in Saint-Domingue. What you find is that as a result of later on in the history, as the slave trade developed on Saint-Domingue, the fact that the French refused to make or made that distinction less than the British, you had a majority of the Africans imported into the colony were prisoners of war. So they were warriors, they were soldiers, they knew how to fight. And that's a very important factor, because you can't subdue soldiers. You see what I'm saying? So by 1791, as you pointed out, 67% of the population in Saint-Domingue are directly from Africa. They're not Creole blacks. So what you find on the island, you have a division between the Africans, who constitute 67% of the population. You have the Creole blacks, which were blacks born on the island, or Africans born on the island. And then you have the mulatto elites, as well as the whites. Now, the whites, there's a distinction that needs to be made between the large plantation.
Slow down, bro. We got time. You want to go too fast? Let's slow down.
Oh, I'm sorry, brother. I'm sorry.
Let's pause this out.
Go ahead.
So we've already determined that 67% of the blacks on the island are Africans who were born free, imported on the island from various tribes, and many of them were actually warriors because they were prisoners of war when they were taken from the African shores.
Absolutely.
Okay? So they are basically the plantation work. They are the hardcore plantation workers. And they're also, because they are not born on the island, not socially acculturated to the Francophone system of the island, probably speak less quality or no quality French. They're learning a form of kind of patois Creole or whatever way of communicating. And they are dying every 5 or 7 years by the hundreds, if not thousands, and requiring a constant influx regularly. Then we have what, as you term, the Creole blacks.
Now, before you go on, Pascal, just real quick, in Vodou, there's a proverb that says, "Depuis nan Guinée, nègre." Now, this is significant because why is it so significant? Because as you pointed out, the Africans we are using the term Africans. The brothers born on the island did not view themselves as African.
Very important
distinction. And so therefore, the unity that you found among the whites on the island did not exist among the Africans when they were imported, because they represented different tribal leadership. And in many instances, they were at war with each other on the continent. And that's a very important distinction, because people, and we'll get to this later on, people can't understand the disunity that has impacted Haiti and its revolution since 1791, because it is that disunity that has Haiti in this quagmire that is in contemporarily.
Right. Well, so, I will agree with that to an extent, but I think that there are nuances, and we're going to continue. So let's move on to the next category of a black individual. Now we have what we call the Creole blacks. Mm-hmm. Now the Creole blacks are blacks who are born on the island.
Yes.
Now, one of the consequences, and you're a sociologist, so I think you appreciate this, of having been born on the island is, number one, I would argue it's safe to say they tend to be a bit less rebellious.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
they were more likely to accept the reality in which they were born into.
Absolutely.
Number two, they would be more socially or maybe even culturally attenuated to the French culture.
Absolutely.
Speak French better, understand French better. Some of them could read, so on and so forth. Next, depending on where their status was prior to the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, very important term, ancien libre, nouveau libre.
Yes.
What does that mean? Ancien libre, old freed, nouveau libre, newly freed. If you were a Creole Black, this is the key, a Black born on the island, and let's say you bought your freedom because you were able to save money, and you bought your freedom 10 years or 15 years before the Haitian Revolution begins in 1791, you are an ancien libre,
yes,
old freed, which means that depending on your entrepreneurship, if you will, you might own property, you might own slaves,
yes,
you might own plantations, you might be trading with whites for slaves or property or the goods from your plantations.
And we have to highlight the fact that many of the revolutionary leaders, from Toussaint to Dessalines to Capois and Henri Christophe, they were slave-owning Creole Blacks.
Right, they were. Some of them were ancien libre.
Yes,
Christophe was an ancien libre. He was an old freed. Toussaint Louverture was an ancien libre. He was old freed. In other words, there was a period of time that they were free before the revolution that allowed them to amass capital, and if not capital, status, and some of them amassed capital as owning slaves. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dessalines was a nouveau libre,
yes,
though he was a Creole.
Some will argue that he was the slave of Toussaint. There's not evidence to support that, but that's
speculation to that effect.
Speculations that have taken
we don't have
place.
any. But what that means, being a nouveau libre, is newly freed, is that though he was born on the island as a slave and may have had all of those acculturations, he stayed a slave until the beginning of the revolution. How the revolution stays. So that would mean that he would not have had the ability to acquire property, wealth, and status prior to the revolution, like Christophe and Toussaint. And it would also, logically, we don't have to read the man's mind, he would probably have less affection for the overall interworkings of the plantation system, and perhaps more internal antagonism to the nature of the system, because he never really enjoyed the lux and the benefits of the system prior to the revolution.
Absolutely.
So that may inure him or provide him with a particular animus against his enslavers, black or white, as a matter of fact.
Now, before we go on, I think this is a time where we should now view or look at the interaction between the Africans now and the Creole Blacks. So this is very important, because the Creole Blacks look down on the Africans on the island. In fact, there's a pejorative term by which they refer to them as bossal.
Bossal, yes.
So they look down on the Africans because the Africans had to do many of the hard labor on the plantation. And because many of these nouveau and ancien libre, they viewed themselves as Frenchmen. That's the other issue we have to look at. Because of their freedom and their access to capital and access to the plantation system, the Creole Blacks would subsequently view themselves somewhat as French. They viewed themselves as French citizens. Toussaint viewed himself as a French citizen. And we have to remember that. Whereas the Africans did not, because they were acculturated and socialized in a different form of system and social integration prior to arriving on the island. So the level of socialization on the island by the Creole Blacks put them closer to French culture and French society than the Africans. So there was a tremendous antagonism between the two groups, and to the point where the whites would foster some of the antagonism. They would use Creole Blacks as plantation heads of plantations to control the newly arrived Africans.
Well, what's fascinating is that one of the actual statutes, or this was by law, that existed in pre-revolutionary Haiti, called Saint-Domingue, is that by law, the slave catchers exclusively were free people of color, either free blacks or free mulattoes.
Or free blacks or free mulattoes, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the other thing we have to understand about Haiti. And this is the importance of Karl Marx, too, when we want to analyze these classes or these categories develop, for the most part, as classes for themselves, not classes in themselves. As classes in themselves, they're not conscious. They develop as classes for themselves. The mulatto elites were classified as mulattoes and develop as, and their practices develop as a class for themselves. They view themselves distinctively from the Creole Blacks, and the Creole Blacks view themselves distinctively from the Africans, and they develop as distinct classes over the years, and they became reified as those classes. Okay, so the history of Haiti is a development of these classes, including the whites, even though Dessalines would eliminate some of the French whites on the island, not all of them, but most of them. But they develop as classes for themselves. They were reified classes by law. The slave codes of Haiti reified these classes. The mulattoes, although they could not practice certain professions like law, etc., many of their their fathers who were French would send them to school, back to school. And I don't think we've made that classification. We're still stuck at the Africans and the Creole Blacks. Right. Let's hit the mulatto class.
Yeah. So we've pretty much categorized the Creoles,
yes,
right, which are blacks born on the island, and we got the Bosal, which are the Africans born in Africa imported, who make up 67% of the population of blacks. Then we have the mulattoes, biracials. The term, I know it's not popular term today, but that's the term we use in Haiti. These are, we would call them black today, but they are biracial.
Yes.
In other words, these are people born on pre-revolutionary Haiti, Saint-Domingue, who would normally have usually a black father, a white father, so we have French white father, and an African or a black mother, or either a Creole or a black Creole mother, or a black African, perhaps Bosal mother, but the mother would be black and the father would almost always be white, normally would be white.
Yes.
The child would be mixed race. Because of the nature of the French plantation system, the French, unlike maybe the British or the Americans, would inure economic and also educational benefits on their mixed race children.
Yes.
So they would send them to school. They would very few of them would have to be slaves. Sometimes that did happen. Some of them were, but very few of them were born slaves. So usually they were born free. They were able to get education. They would be able to go to school. They would be able to acquire inheritance and wealth and property from their paternal status. And they often owned slaves, but also so did the free blacks who acquired wealth before the revolution as ancien libre.
Absolutely.
So at a certain point, what was called, and the term is used, is affranchi. Now, affranchi is a term that means free people of color, basically, which are the free blacks before the revolution,
well as the mulattoes,
and the free mulattoes before the revolution. This class, the affranchi, the free blacks, were Creoles, the free Creole blacks, and the free Creole mulattoes, all born on the island. Both of them together form the affranchi class, and they own up until maybe 25% of the Bosal Africans on the island.
Yes. And what you find now are and here is where we get into the class interest. So now you have the affranchi, which is inclusive of the free blacks as well as the mulatto elites. And then you have the Bosal. And on top of that, you have the whites. You have the poor whites, and you have plantation owning wealthy whites on the island. So now there is discord between the wealthy plantation owners who, as Pascal pointed out, would send their heirs to schools in France. They would provide them with plantations, etc. They had land, etc. And the poor whites were against that to some extent because they were landless. Many of the poor whites on Saint-Domingue did not have land, and they looked down on the mulattoes because of this racial class structure that was emerging in 18th century Saint-Domingue. The poor whites still held themselves in high esteem vis-a-vis the mulatto elites. I'm sorry, the mulattoes on the island. However, the mulattoes on the island were more educated than the poor whites and had more land than the poor whites. So there's discord between the mulattoes, the poor whites, as well as the wealthy whites, who to some extent use the mulattoes as an intermediary class against the Africans as well as the Creole blacks. Yes. So the interest of the mulattoes on the island pre-revolutionary Haiti is simply they were French. They studied in French. They were acculturated and socialized in the French system. Their problem against the system as it was established was the fact that they could not participate in certain professions. They could not be lawyers. They could not be doctors, etc. And this emerges because of the poor whites and the racial antagonism on the island as a result of the poor whites wanting privileges that the mulattoes had from their forefathers. So now the interest of the mulatto elites is to rid the island of this black code noir of the plantation so that they can partake as complete citizens into the functioning of the society. They were prevented from partaking because they weren't allowed to enter into certain professions. So on the one hand, you have the mulattoes with their interest. They did not care to get rid of the plantation system. And that's another misnomer that we have in terms of understanding the revolution. The assumption, because what we do, especially in North America, is we extrapolate this one drop black blood rule to Haiti. That was not the case. The mulatto elites viewed themselves as a distinct group who simply wanted to maintain the plantation system. All they wanted to do is partake in governing and participating in the economic structure of the plantation system.
Equally as whites.
Equally to whites.
As French whites, yes.
As French whites, absolutely. And the poor whites were against that, obviously. They had no land, and basically they viewed, and this was in terms racially, they viewed themselves as superior to the mulatto elite.
Right.
Even though economically and politically, the mulatto elites had more power than they did.
And what is ironic is that the free blacks who were ancien libre, the older free blacks, aspire to that same status as the mulatto, to be basically French property owning equal to the white males. In terms
absolutely. And so now, as Pascal pointed out, just like the mulatto elites wanted, their aspiration was to partake in the social system, the same thing held true with the Creole blacks. And that would cause antagonism between the Creole blacks, the mulatto elites, who basically were an intermediary class to protect the plantation system from the Africans. There would be antagonism between the mulattoes, the Creole blacks, and the Africans over the constitution of the plantation system. There is antagonism between the mulattoes and the Creole blacks on racial grounds. There is antagonism between the Creole blacks and the Africans on not only on cultural grounds, but on economic grounds as well. Because the Africans owned nothing. They basically were laborers on the plantation. So these conflicting interests would take us to pre-revolutionary Haiti 1791. So now we date the beginning of the Haitian Revolution August 14, 1791, with the ceremony of Bois-Caïman.
Which was, and we won't have to get too detailed, a congregation. It was basically, I like to use the term, a spiritual pact. And what I mean spiritual pact is that understanding you have different tribes of Africans you're going to have different tribes with different languages and different religions. So you're going to have people who are coming from the animist pantheon tradition of Yoruba faiths, if you will. You're going to have people coming from ancestor worshiping faiths from West Africa. You're going to have some who are Muslims. These now on the African continent, these, depending on the tribe and their religion and a combination of varying factors, could have, and maybe even more likely would have, been warring factions for a variety of reasons.
Yes.
On the island on August 14th, there was a decision to have a ceremony in which basically the varying religious African Bosal, and I believe there are some presence of even some Creole Blacks as well who were there at that time.
That's a debatable. I like to stop you here, Pascal, because here is an interesting debate that has plagued Haitian studies. We understand that Bois Caiman is historically, some will argue, Patrick Balaguer argues that there are 21 nations represented at Bois Caiman, 21 African tribal nations represented at Bois Caiman. The question now becomes, are Creole Blacks and all the mulatto elites represented at this Congress, as we would call it, at Bois Caiman? Because if they are, it implies that there's a unity of self-interest to revolt against the system of slavery. And we've already argued that no, the mulattoes, for the most part, are trying to salvage the system. All they want to do is participate in the system, as well as the Creole Blacks.
Or rebel against it on their terms.
On their terms, absolutely, absolutely. So now some will argue Toussaint was present at Bois Caiman as a Creole Black. Some will argue there's a mulatto present in the form of Cecile Fatima, who
right. Well, Cecile Fatima, the normal narrative is that Cecile Fatima, who was a mulattress. There's a ceremony where there is a hog that is slaughtered. Boukman, who is believed to be a Muslim African, reads a prayer, basically saying the God of the God of the whites means you all but harm, and our God means of liberty, so on and so forth, to that effect. And the whole drums, the whole nine. There's a strong energy and vibe amongst the Africans there, and they slaughter a pig, and some drink the blood of the pig there to symbolize their willingness and readiness to go to war
against the plantation system.
Against the plantation system.
Absolutely.
This happens. I'm not really interested in going into all the details.
No. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely
but
not.
the bottom line is that
it's an African. The ceremony is an African-driven process.
Right. These are Bosals. These are
Bosals. Yes.
These are not
Creole Blacks or mulattoes.
Right.
Although revisionist history, when the mulattoes write the history of Haiti, they want to infuse themselves in Bois Caiman.
The major actors are Bosals.
Bosals, absolutely.
Contrary
they agreed to start the revolution 7 days after this ceremony.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Well, my point is that many people believe that the revolution starts right after that. That's not correct.
No.
They wait a week after ceremony Bois Caiman, and then they start a massive
revolt,
massive guerrilla warfare against plantations across, particularly the area of the north, and start burning plantations and killing plantation masters across the board.
So now here is where the interests of the three groups play out over a 13-year period. So what you have on the one hand are the mulattoes at the onset of the revolution who are the enforcers to stop the revolution. The Affranchis are called upon by the whites to basically stop the African Revolution.
Because the Affranchis, which are the Creole Blacks, the free blacks and the free mulattoes, the Creole Blacks and the Creole mulattoes, they are the slave catchers under normal circumstances.
Absolutely. So now what you find is that the different interests now will develop or unfold over a 13-year period between the mulattoes who are trying to guide the revolution towards their interests, and the Creole Blacks, who also are trying to guide the revolution and their interests as well, and the Africans who want to rid themselves of the plantation system altogether.
Right. So this is the what I would call, let's say, the insurgent phase of the Haitian Revolution. It is an insurgency. This insurgency starts in 1791, and it continues. Now, let's understand that France is dealing with the internal conflicts of the French Revolution at that time, and is very worried about losing control of its most prized possession. At that time, we also know that pre-revolutionary Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, is worth more in trade. It's the richest colony in the Caribbean and worth more in trade than all 13 colonies in North America.
Absolutely.
It's called the Pearl of the Antilles. The French are concerned. And what we know, this is
the
very
French are at war with the British as well now.
And the French are at war with the British at that time. The white plantation owners in pre-revolutionary Haiti are so worried about preserving their property and also deciding which faction of the French Revolution do they want to part with, the royalists or the revolutionaries in France. In other words, the king or the actual new revolutionary administration. And what happens is the landowning, plantation-owning whites, this is very important, they request the Spanish and the British to come into the island to protect the institution of slavery on the island from the Africans, because the plantation owners were more willing and interested to be loyal to a crown, whether it was the British or the French, than risk the instability of France causing them to lose their property. So they invite the Spanish and the British. Am I correct or incorrect?
No. And to some extent, remember, the eastern side of the island is also ruled by the Spanish. So the Spanish they have their own interest in trying to protect the eastern half of the island from the insurgency that's happening on the western side. The other issue that we forgot to mention is the fact that the wealthy plantation owners in Saint-Domingue have their own interests. Because of the mercantilist system that dominated the 18th century at the time, prior to industrial capitalism emerging with Adam Smith, they had an issue with France. And this is the wealthy plantation owners. The issue was they were not allowed to freely trade with the Spanish and the British, and it would have been cheaper for them to do so. Free trade would have been better because they would have accumulate more capital. So it required, the mercantilist system required that whatever agricultural products they produced had to be shipped to Paris, to France. Right. So as a result of that, they were against that. And this is important because now we're starting to see the emergence of mercantilism and capitalism, because Adam Smith is the one who would conceptualize the free trade mantra of the emerging middle classes of the time, the plantation owner. Adam Smith conceptualizes their interests. So on the one hand, you have the wealthy plantation owners who want free trade, and on the other hand, you have the metropole who refuses because they want to accumulate as
they want to have a monopoly over the goods.
Exactly, over the colonies.
So there's a very good nuance you added, because this exacerbates the desire of the plantation owners to say, let's get the Spanish and the British in. We want to be able to trade with them anyway. It's good for business. We'll get rid of France and so on and so forth. So the Spanish come in, and this is a very important point. Understand, the Spanish and the British are coming in initially, first the Spanish, to protect slavery and squash the insurgency. Who do the Spanish recruit in, I believe, 1793, 1792 or 3?
92, 93, they recruit the Creole Blacks.
They recruit Creole Blacks. And they're recruiting Creole Blacks to fight for Spain on Team Protect Slavery. So that means they're recruiting free blacks, or even some who might not have been free, blacks born on the island to fight against the Africans who are rebelling to protect slavery. And guess what? They don't have a problem finding Creole blacks who want to
Absolutely not.
volunteer. And guess what? Who was one of the better generals who volunteered for that job?
Toussaint Louverture. And not only that, so now what you find is the mulattoes are now fighting against the Creole blacks because they realize if the Spanish win, they'll lose out. So they're fighting for the French against the Creole blacks and the Africans as well. So there's a conflict between the insurgency who wants to get rid of the plantation system, the Creole blacks who are fighting with the British and the Spanish for their interests, and then the mulattoes who are fighting on behalf of the French because they want to maintain their wealth as well. So all of this conflict will basically evolve over a 13 year period.
We got time, brother. We got time. We're doing a good job. We got time. So Toussaint Louverture, I believe that did Christophe fight for Spain? Or was he fighting for the British?
Mm-hmm.
They
all fought. They were fighting with Spain.
And our brother George Biassou, who ends up leaving Saint-Domingue and going to live in Florida, he was fighting for Spain as well. As a matter of fact, Toussaint Louverture was so high ranking that he actually was given like a special Spanish like Juarez or Cross or something like that, a special Spanish award. Now, not only that, according to Laurent Dubois, he cites that the fact that once the 1791 rebellion begins, this is according to Dubois, Toussaint Louverture starts, and you know you've read this as well as I have, by reaching out to the French.
Yes, absolutely.
To betray the insurgency to help protect the plantation system.
Because Toussaint, their fear is that the French would impose the plantation system on the island. Because remember, the French plantation system discriminated against the Creole blacks. So the Creole blacks, they were given a special status within the Spanish army that they were not given in the French army, which is why they turned and fought against with the Spanish. They fought with the Spanish against the insurgency. So what you find is that Toussaint is basically playing devil's advocate. On the one hand, he's fighting with the Spanish while simultaneously appealing to the French for recognition. In fact, he writes to the French and say, hey, I'm willing to turn and fight for France if we are given the ability to govern and maintain the property we have ascertained as a result of the insurgency. Because what we have to remember, many of the leadership, the Creole leadership, because of the insurgency and the fleeing of the French to the Caribbean and back to France, they acquired land. So a substantial amount of land.
While working with the British, he's saying to the French and letting them know, like, yo, listen, y'all let me keep my property, my status, my title, and let us govern some of this stuff while these white folk are fleeing. We'll help you shut these Africans down and make things good.
And remember, the French Napoleon is at war with Spain and the British.
Napoleon's not in power yet. You going too fast.
No, I'm sorry.
Napoleon doesn't come into power till the end of this whole.
Yes.
Napoleon,
no, but I'm saying the French are at war with the Spanish because it's a fight over colonies.
Right. The French and the British are basically fighting at war with the French, with the Spanish and the British. This is the key. The French are going through the French Revolution.
Yes.
They used to be a monarchy. They're trying to get rid of the monarchy. Spain is a monarchy. Britain is a monarchy. The collapse of the monarchy is viewed as a threat to both Spain and Britain. And they also want to fight to make sure that they can get France's colonies when France collapses. And so as a result, France is in a situation where its most prized possession, Saint-Domingue, is being usurped by its enemies, Spain and Britain, who are trying to take advantage of the fact that it's going through its internal revolution at the time. So this is the key, though. At this point,
And Pascal, not to cut you off, boy, remember, it's by duplicitous means that the French acquired Saint-Domingue from the Spanish to start with.
That's right. The
Through
Treaty of
piracy.
Ryswick that starts in
Yeah, so they
1657.
want the colony back anyway.
Right. The Spanish want it back because they got it because the French pirates, what they call buccaneers or buccaneers, were circling the land and stealing the booty from the Spaniards, and it caused a fight between the Spanish and the French. And it was the Treaty of Ryswick in 1627 allows the French to take the eastern half. So now we're going too far back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the larger point is like, so France is in this situation. The Spanish and the British are fighting against them to take the island, to take their colonies, and they're having the internal contradictions of their French Revolution. So what's happening at the time is that the Spanish have Louverture and the British are coming in, and the British are now trying to subdue the Africans and to basically seize hold. In 1793, Louverture is still fighting for the French. Sontonax, the Spanish. I apologize. So the Spanish in 1793. Sontonax, who is the white French governor general of the island, basically
who is sent by France
to the island, yes. Sent by France to the island, realizes like, yo, we got to do something drastic. This is too combustible of a situation. We can lose everything here. And he gets permission from, I believe, the French Congress to free the blacks. All right. Now, this is the question when they say free the Creole Blacks.
Yes.
That's something that's very
to basically serve the interests of the Creole Blacks and the mulattoes. That's the important thing here.
They are not freeing the Bosal at all.
Absolutely not.
They are freeing the Creole Blacks, which are the blacks born on the island, like Toussaint, like Dessalines, like all of them. All right.
Their interest is in maintaining the mercantilist system on the island with African labor. So the concept is no longer to have free labor, but to pay the African labor force in terms of goods. So that is in line with the interests of the Creole Blacks to some extent, but not necessarily the mulattoes, because the mulattoes still have the interest of participating in certain professions that they were not allowed to participate in.
So what you're saying is that the Sontonax is going to free the Creole Blacks, but he wants to add a certain incentive to pacify the Africans,
which is the corvée system,
which is called the corvée system.
Yes,
because they are not simply bondsmen by birth, but they are bondsmen with the same amount of brutality, but they will get compensated for a degree or a percentage of the crops that they pick.
Yes, this is this is the issue.
Some will call this indentured servitude.
Absolutely. So the problem with the Africans now, this is a precarious situation because some will argue that the Africans capitulate to this new world order that Sontonax comes in with, but it's a shaky one because Toussaint's godson Moise, who is fighting on the side of the Africans, does not completely subscribe to this new policy.
Right, but you're going ahead of time. Okay, now. So Sontonax issues an order that comes down in he issues the order in 1793, but it doesn't take hold until 1794.
Yes.
Now back to Toussaint Louverture does not abandon the Spanish until that order is fully
in effect. Yes.
In 1794. And that is the first time Toussaint Louverture starts to fight on
the side of the French.
French. And on team fight against certain types of slavery, which is slavery for his class, but to keep the corvée. So now Toussaint Louverture is fighting as a French general, and the Black Creoles, because of what Sontonax does in freeing them totally, and they're the high-ranking general. But don't forget, they're getting all this experience fighting for the Spanish and whatnot. They leave the Spanish and they join the French army.
And they become then enforcers to get the Africans back onto the plantation system and re-engineer the whole mercantilist system.
Right.
Now there is conflict.
They are French soldiers and generals who are going to now fight against the Spanish and the British,
and the
while
African
also
insurgency,
fighting the Africans to capitulate to this new form of slavery light, which wasn't that light, that was needed in their eyes to maintain the system.
Absolutely. And then there's conflict now over the management of the mercantilist plantation system post the Creole Blacks capitulating to France following Sonthonax's order. The problem now becomes, should in the eyes of the mulattoes, should the Creole Blacks maintain the land that they had acquired under the Spanish and under the British, or should we go revert back to the plantation system prior to 1791,
right,
where the
slave
masters,
they want to inherit their parents' property?
Not only inherit the plantation system, but should the whites return back on the island? Sonthonax, there is conflict between Sonthonax and Toussaint over whether or not the whites should be allowed to govern the plantation system, or should they be allowed that the Creole Blacks govern with the African labor force working
this is
under
going
them.
to cause a problem. This is when
this is going to cause a problem,
because Toussaint is going to say, I want the whites in, and he wants to use the whites as a buffer against the mulattoes.
Yes, because what they want, and this is the problem, because what they want to demonstrate, when I say they, Toussaint, the Creole Blacks, they want to demonstrate that the Creole Blacks are able to be French, able to operate the system without slavery, but as like you said, an indentured servitude, the corvée system that maintains the mercantilist system. The Africans are still at the bottom of the barrel, bro,
and they're still able to import more Africans.
Exactly, and that's the other issue. Toussaint, well, we haven't gotten that far yet. We haven't gotten that far.
Now, contrary to most people understand, we're talking about Toussaint Louverture fighting the French. The majority of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture is fighting for the French against the Spanish and the British. He's fighting against the Spanish and the British from 1793 or 1794 when he jumps in, all the way, I believe, the British don't leave till 1798.
Yes,
as a matter of fact.
1798, 1799, absolutely.
Yeah, that's when the 1798, 1799 is when the British and the Spanish. So for those years, Toussaint Louverture is leading the generals. Now the mulattoes are fighting with Louverture at that time because they're all fighting under the French. Right? Louverture is the general on the top, but there is conflict because the mulattoes are saying, well, how is this going to work out in terms of who's going to get the property?
Who will govern the island?
Who will govern the island here?
Yes, exactly. Toussaint wants to bring back the French plantation owners, and the mulatto elites really do not. They don't want them back,
right?
Because they have more power without them.
Right, exactly. So we're not there yet. So they're fighting against the British and the Spanish, and they're kicking booty. Louverture valiantly slaughters the Spanish. The Spanish retreat to Dominican Republic. Eventually they leave. The French were going to take that over, and he's fighting the British. The British, at one point, they lose 10,000 soldiers in 2 months. They're being devastated. So this goes on till 1788, 1799. 1788, the British, I think they evacuate. The Spanish are pretty much
1798, bro.
1798.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, this is what happens. 1799, Louverture is pretty much the head big man on campus.
Louverture, Rigaud, Pétion, Boyer are now the head honchos on the island.
Right.
The Creole Blacks fighting under Toussaint, and the mulattoes are fighting under Rigaud.
They were fighting the Spanish and the British together.
Yes.
At this stage is where the conflict kicks in, because now the Spanish and the British are gone, and this is very important. 1799 is the year that Napoleon takes over France.
Absolutely.
In a coup d'etat. All right, that's very important. So now everyone is shaky in terms of their status. What was the event that caused the actual War of the South, or War of the Knives? What sparked it off?
Rigaud decides he doesn't like the fact that the Creole Blacks are basically, Sonthonax have given the Creole Blacks positions of power and allowed them to maintain territories and land that they acquired from the Spanish and the British. So now Rigaud and the mulattoes are upset over that because now they're at a disadvantage. On top of that, you have Toussaint. The discussion becomes who should govern the island post the departure of the Spanish and the British. Toussaint, on the one hand, his desire is to have the French return, the French plantation owners return on the island and introduce the corvée system where the Africans would work on the plantations and they would give 25%, they would be allowed to maintain 25% of all crops that they produce. So this was a sort of barter system. Whatever crops were produced, the Africans retained 25% and the slave master would get the remaining 75% of the crops. On the other hand, the mulattoes did not want that because remember, with the whites returning, they are now second-class citizens again with the white plantation owners back.
And so there is conflict. In the psychology of Toussaint, his bigger enemy are the mulatto blacks.
Absolutely.
In comparison to the white former plantation owners.
Absolutely. Because he understands that the mulattoes are just as racist as the white plantation owners. And that's another misnomer about the Haitian Revolution. We think, the mulattoes were black just like the Creole Blacks and the Africans. No. They view themselves as a distinct class. So you have Rigaud now who decide he is going to revolt against Dessalines and the Creole Blacks and Sonthonax so that they can now maintain or gain control over the island.
So that this starts a civil war.
A civil war
within the Haitian Revolution called the War of the South or the War of the Knives.
The War of Knives. So
what's interesting in this war, a lot of people don't know this, the United States supports Toussaint Louverture in this war and sends him weapons and all of the military he needs to fight against the mulattoes.
And people, and this is very important. Now, many of my students have the issue of understanding, why would the United States support Toussaint over the mulattoes?
Because I think I answered the question. Because the United States is encouraging, this is the key, very important, encouraging Toussaint Louverture to shut down the mulattoes who are in love with the French.
Yes, absolutely.
So that Haiti can become independent.
Yes.
So that Haiti can have better trade relations with the United States.
Yes. And at this time, Dessalines has a saying, it doesn't matter. The whites, as long as money is involved, the whites will trade with anybody. So
John Adams was president at the time.
Yes.
John Adams, of the first three presidents of the United States, John Adams was the only one that was sympathetic to the cause of the Haitian Revolution, more so out of economic interest. He hated the French. George Washington had no problem with the French because they helped him in the American Revolution. You know that Thomas Jefferson was a complete Francophile. He loved the French. John Adams always screwed the French. That was like his policy as a president. He's like, F the French, we can't stand them. So he would have done anything to undermine the French and cause them to lose the island. So John Adams is literally encouraging Louverture to fight these mulattoes and, hey, man, get independence. And this is the thing. For Haitians who believe Toussaint Louverture was some kind of leader of independence, he demurs from fighting for independence.
And this is important as well, because what would happen is Toussaint sends Dessalines to the south to go and fight Rigaud. And what would happen is, upon their defeat, Rigaud, Pétion, Boyer, they all flee to France.
This is the key. Let's talk about the war. It's very important. So this goes on for about a year.
Dessalines decimates.
Sends Dessalines to the south to handle these mulattoes, these high yellow Negroes. And Dessalines, being the extreme hardcore general he is, he massacres
them.
Massacres these mulattoes in the south. Massacres them. So bad that they flee, and I think they flee after Napoleon has taken over France.
Yes.
They leave in 1800. They flee Saint-Domingue to revolutionary Haiti, and they go to France. If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, they return to France. In fact, they will petition Napoleon to send them back to reclaim the island for France.
Well, we know that. We're going to expose all these Negroes' treachery. We're going to get there. So France accepts them. Boyer, who was a high-ranking general, Rigaud, who was the leader of the pack, and Pétion, also a high-ranking general, leave Saint-Domingue to go to France under Napoleon. These names are important because all of these names are eventual leaders who betray the Haitian Revolution project and revolution.
Absolutely.
So they go to France. So the War of the Knives or the War of the South is won. Dessalines is like, oh, this is great. Toussaint is rocking in the show. So now,
Toussaint the treachery of Toussaint against Sonthonax now.
Right now, Toussaint Louverture is like, all right, I got rid of the mulattoes here. Sonthonax is the man, and he's like, yo, Sonthonax, my man. Because Sonthonax does not want the whites to come back to the island.
No,
absolutely. Because Sonthonax like, if we bring the whites back, these Africans are going to agree to the deal, and everything's going to fall apart. Absolutely. We won't have the corvée. Everything will collapse. My man, now we don't need the whites. We don't need the whites. Y'all can rock out. Y'all can chill. We'll be all right. We can be a French colony and whatnot. Everything. But Toussaint wants to be the head Negro in charge, and he wants to bump Sonthonax because he wants to invite the whites back, because he wants to be able to say, I'm the big Negro who runs everything for the blacks and the whites for France.
Yes.
So what is the intrigue that causes Toussaint Louverture to betray Sonthonax and have him sent away?
So what Toussaint does now is he basically isolates Sonthonax, and he says to the Africans, remember, and this is where color becomes very important on the island of Haiti. Toussaint appeals to the Africans by referring to himself as a Wangan, as color. So now he participates. He wants the Africans to view him as Papa Toussaint, because for a long time, remember, on the island, the Africans viewed Sonthonax as the liberator, because he is the one who introduced or who demolishes the Côte Noire. So what Toussaint does now, he isolates Sonthonax to the point where he has to now return back to the island. He realizes, back to France. So now, upon his return to France, Toussaint has complete control over the island.
And Sonthonax leaves the island in 1801, 1800?
1800.
So Sonthonax goes back to France. The mulatto three generals go back to France, and the mulattoes as well go back to France. And now Toussaint Louverture has got the island under his control as governor general. He refers to
himself as governor general.
He writes a constitution.
Yes.
Which keeps the corvée system and explicitly allows the importing of African slaves in the Constitution. And he goes as far to say, former white plantation owners, you can come back. Then they start to return. And this is the point where his nephew Moise was like, my man, you have gone too far.
And Moise will rebel against this process, and Toussaint will massacre Moise and basically runs the colony until the Constitution is written in 1801 by the former plantation owners.
Right, that's the key. The former plantation owners
would write the Constitution of 1801, in which they maintain the slave trade, the African slave trade. They maintain the corvée system. And they declared Toussaint governor general for life on the island.
Correct. Now, they said
Upon
this to
that,
Napoleon. He says this to Napoleon in 1801. First of all, and Napoleon is furious. But the thing that makes Napoleon furious, because you're like, Napoleon, this is the perfect hookup. You keep the
yes,
colony, you keep 2 cents there, everything is fine. And people think, oh, it's Napoleon's irrational racism. It's not the irrational racism. What it is part of his deal is that he starts to trade with the Americans and the British.
freely.
And before that, he could only
absolutely.
trade with France.
Yes.
And that was the aspect of his constitution and leadership that
infuriated.
Napoleon.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to mention that. That is the most important aspect, is that Toussaint, in allowing the plant, he did not allow the former plantation owners back on the island under the same mercantilist system. He allowed free trade between the British, the Americans, and the Spanish at the time. And that, as you mentioned, infuriated to Napoleon. And then there's some racial issues as well. Napoleon was a racist, of course, as many of them back then were. And he viewed Toussaint writing him saying, hey, I can manage this, but maintain the system. You don't have to worry. Oh, Napoleon is infuriated. And at that point, Napoleon calls upon his brother-in-law, Leclerc, to now return with the mulattoes.
Napoleon, who's now the leader of France, taking it over, got the French Revolution under control. He summons the mulattoes who left pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue, which is Boyer, Pétion, Rigaud, to go with Leclerc, his white French general, to be summoned to fight with the French army, a massive army, I believe, over 50,000. He sends two troops, one to New Orleans and one to Saint-Domingue, but we don't have to go there yet. A massive army to send them back to Saint-Domingue to subdue Toussaint Louverture and the Creole generals. Okay.
Now the
question I do not believe the instruction to reinstitute slavery had been given at that time yet.
Some say it had. If you read Laurent Dubois, he argues that yes, Leclerc is giving the orders to reinstitute, number one, massacre all children under the age of 12, adults, everybody, and reinstitute slavery on the island. Remember, Leclerc is the one who would change that order because he realized he needed the help of the Creole Blacks in order to subdue the island.
Very good. Thank you for correcting me. So Napoleon is like massacre all these Negroes. In his mind, massacre them all, take them all, kill them, genocide them. We'll start from scratch.
Just leave the women, leave the women
Leclerc,
and the children under 10.
Leclerc is saying, "Yo, listen, we can't go that far. Let me change this up. Let's change this up a little bit because he wants to."
Now you're moving a little too fast, brother. So Leclerc lands on the island. Now, at the time when Leclerc is commissioned to go and fight in Saint-Domingue, he arrives. Now the island is controlled by Toussaint with his Creole generals. Remember, he's rid himself of the mulattoes.
The Creole Black.
So now you have
Dessalines, Christophe,
Capois, and there is many people think it's peaceful coexistence. No, the Africans are still in revolt, even under Toussaint.
And people are pissed off that Toussaint murdered Moise, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly
because there is still conflict. There's still Africans who would go and form maroon communities into the mountains in the provinces of the island because they were against. Remember, they are against the plantation system in general. Forget about whereas the mulattoes and the Creole Blacks, they simply want to participate in the system. The Creole, the Africans want nothing to do with the system. So upon his arrival, Toussaint informs his lieutenants, Dessalines, Capois, to burn down their plantations, scorch their plantation, and they do so. So now he has to get the Africans to also fight with them when they see the French arriving. And of course, many of the Africans refuse. And the African leadership at that time is Sun Souci, Congolese warrior, and Makaya, another Congolese warrior. They refused. So the Creole Blacks now, Leclerc and Rigaud and the mulattoes arrive on the island, and fighting ensues. Eventually, the Creole Blacks will capitulate and surrender to Leclerc and the mulatto leadership.
40% of Louverture's army capitulates at that time,
Yes,
which is led
absolutely.
by Christophe. Christophe capitulates at that time, and they all surrender to Leclerc.
And they're allowed to keep their plantation in the land that they had acquired.
Right.
So
the Creole Blacks surrendered to
simply
Leclerc
returned
and
to
the mulattoes
plantation.
who are fighting under France because the negotiating deal is that they can keep their land and their
Yes.
plantation.
And this is where Leclerc changes Napoleon's orders.
Gotcha.
Remember, Napoleon tells him massacre all the blacks, the leadership, everything, and reinstitute slavery on the island. But he realized that his biggest fight is against the Africans and the Maroons in these areas.
This is key. This becomes necessary. This is interesting. This becomes necessary because Toussaint Louverture is unable to get the Africans to agree to fight for him
because they did not trust him.
They didn't trust him. Why? Because of the corvée system.
The corvée system, absolutely. So now, when the Creole Blacks capitulate, so now what you find is the Leclerc request that they help them subdue the Africans. And now here is another debate.
By the way, this is very important because we can't neglect my man. Is that
go ahead?
Dessalines is the last holdout of the Creole generals.
Yes,
to surrender
because remember, he's holding out at the request of Toussaint. Toussaint asked him to hold out.
Right. He does not surrender. Yes. But at a certain point, Toussaint Louverture demands of Dessalines to surrender to Leclerc.
Yes. However, Dessalines realized that Toussaint is playing a political game here. He continues to support or incite the Africans to continue to fight while telling or informing his Creole generals to capitulate to France. And once the Creole generals capitulate to France, they start to fight against the Africans who by 1802, they're kicking the shit out of the French.
Right. So basically, Toussaint Louverture is trying to set himself up in a situation where he can win no matter what side wins the fight.
Because by spring of 1801, Leclerc realized and the mulatto leadership realized that they cannot win because the Africans, their guerrilla tactics were in the onset of yellow fever would be problematic. So now this is when they conscript the Creole Blacks to help them to defeat. Now, Dessalines will betray Toussaint.
Because he realized
Toussaint is playing the end.
Toussaint is setting up all his Creole generals to be slaughtered, hoping that the Africans will win and then he'll side with the Africans.
Yes.
Or if the Creole Blacks win, he'll still be one of the Creoles, and if the French win, he'll still be down with them. And Dessalines is like, my man, you're not setting me up to get played like that. You got to go.
So Dessalines now basically sells out Toussaint to the French. They capture him and they send him off to France. At that point, the assumption is we can win or we will be able to defeat the Africans, but that's not the case, bruh. So by 1802, by January 1802, the Africans are winning.
Right.
The French are dying, yellow fever. The Africans are go ahead.
Right. And this is what I argue is the linchpin that changes the whole game. Leclerc dies of yellow fever.
And Rochambeau.
And the Mad Dog from Hell is made general of Napoleon's army, who is
Rochambeau.
And Rochambeau is not trying to hear no negotiating, make no black generals, no Creole generals, no mulatto generals. Rochambeau is coming and saying, I'm going to massacre all of you darkies, no matter what shade you are, and I will genocide you all. By the way, also,
will reintroduce Napoleon's original plan.
The original plan was to genocide everyone. And also, word got out that Napoleon had instituted slavery in Guadeloupe.
Absolutely. So now Dessalines realized, hey, the Africans are winning. If the Africans win, they're getting rid of the Creole Blacks and the mulattoes and the French white, and they'll control the island on their own. So Dessalines decides he's going to meet with the mulatto leadership at a place in Haiti called Akaye. We call this the Treaty of Akaye. So Dessalines meets with the with the mulatto leadership under the head of Pétion, and he says to Pétion, okay, if the Africans win, we're SOL. If Rochambeau wins, we're SOL, because he's going to massacre mulattoes and Negroes. He doesn't
Africans,
care.
Everybody.
So at this point, Dessalines forges an agreement, a compact with Pétion, and they decide they got to rid themselves of the French. Simultaneously, it is up to Dessalines now to subdue the Africans, to help them fight against the French. So now they would control the island, and then they would decide. So now Dessalines has to go to the African leadership. And this is why when we started, we made the distinction between the Africans, the Creoles, and the mulattoes. Dessalines has to approach the African leadership, who is under Sans Souci at the time. So he sends Christophe he summons Christophe to summon Sans Souci to get the Africans to fight, not under the African command, but under Dessalines as general of the L'armée indigène at the time. So Sans Souci says no. Sans Souci was like, no, we're winning. We don't trust the Creole Blacks, and we don't trust the mulattoes. By the end of the war, we will decimate all of you. So Christophe assassinates Sans Souci and assumes the leadership. In fact, he appoints Capois Lamar over the African contingent that was fighting in the north. Right. Now that's very important, because what would happen from that moment on, the war becomes the Creole generals and the mulatto generals fighting with the Africans, fighting under the Creole generals. Remember, the Africans would not fight under the mulattoes under any circumstances.
Right.
Fighting against the French.
So what happens is that after the Treaty of Akaye between the Creole Blacks and the mulattoes, Dessalines sends Christophe to go to the African leadership, which is Sans Souci. Makaya is also a top general, but he goes to Sans Souci. He brings Sans Souci into his holdover to try to negotiate with him. So you got to fight with us. Sans Souci demurs, and bang,
you're out.
Christophe takes him out. They put Capois Lamar as the head of the African army in the north. I guess they were able to subdue those brothers. How they were able to do so, I guess when they lost Sans Souci, they probably felt that they had to capitulate.
They had no choice,
and they decide to fight with the Creole black generals and the mulattoes under Dessalines.
And remember, most of the major fighting is done in the north. The mulatto elites, the mulatto generals, they're in Port-au-Prince in the south, as well as in Port-au-Prince, which is in the west. So they're not the major fighting is not done by the mulattoes. It's done by and it's strategic. This was strategic on behalf of Pétion.
Right. He realized by the Africans and the Creole black generals.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're going from the Battle of and they're defeating now Dessalines in charge, and they're massacring Rochambeau's armies. Well, like they have like 3 or 4 major battles. What are the 3 major battles that they have? They have
the Battle of Vertières. There's a battle. But there's one more battle, and the Battle of Vertières is the final battle. Crête-à-Porot is when Dessalines, they're surrounded by the French, and Dessalines miraculously defeat the French. He escapes and defeats the French. The Battle of Vertières, which is the final battle. There's one more major battle that slipped my mind.
So all these 3 major battles, Dessalines is massacring Napoleon's army which Toussaint Louverture never fought against.
Never. So Rochambeau at that point, Capois at the Battle of Etier, the bravery of these brothers this is where I get this tingly feeling, because these brothers were just the bravery, the skill in battle was. Even the French stopped. The rumor is Rochambeau stops the Battle of Vertier.
Right. This is during the Battle of Vertier.
To congratulate Capois.
Is charging the army up the hill, and then Rochambeau hits a cannon charge, bang, and he knocks down his horse, and then
gets up.
Capois gets en avant, and he keeps going, and then another cannon shot, bang, that's off his hat. He gets up, and he says en avant, and then Rochambeau, the French leader of the Napoleon's army, stops the battle. And he sends him, I believe he gives him a white horse.
Yeah.
He says, we have never seen such an act of
bravery
on any army at all. He takes the horse, and then they continue the battle. And then the Haitian army.
This is the greatest aspect of I tell my students all the time, this is one of the greatest revolutionary stories you will ever, in recorded history, brother. And, November 8th, at the end of that battle, Rochambeau lead. And what's amazing is Dessalines doesn't massacre Rochambeau. He allows him to board and leave and return back to France.
And even though Rochambeau has a plan to still come back and genocide. Genocide the Africans, and which is part of the motivation why Dessalines decides to kill the French, because from Saint-Domingue, French generals are planning to come back to Haiti to genocide the Africans, and he decides to do a preemptive strike and to genocide some of the French on the island who supported the French coming in and massacring the Haitians to protect the sanctity and the sovereignty of the country.
And there's another misnomer.
It was not any kind of revenge or brutal retribution. It was a preemptive strike to protect the sovereignty of the country.
And there's another misnomer that Dessalines was so racist that he massacred all the whites on the island. That's not the case.
White women were not only allowed to stay on the island, they were allowed to own land.
There was a contingency of Polish soldiers who were allowed to stay and acquire land on the island. But anyway, so November 18th, the battle is over, 1803. And January 1st, 1804, Dessalines declares, and once again, another misnomer, Haiti is not founded as a republic.
That's correct.
Haiti is an empire, and Dessalines is the first emperor.
Well, that doesn't happen right away. He finds
No. Yeah, but he doesn't declare Haiti an independent republic. That would take many years, and it would be under Pétion that they would declare
Haiti nation, an independent nation.
Yeah, he declares Haiti an independent nation, and he writes a constitution. And this constitution does not allow whites to own land on the island.
Right.
He does reintroduce the corvée system on the island. In that constitution,
but he stops no importation of African slaves.
No importation. He had no choice at this point. And so for 2 years, Dessalines would run Haiti as a mercantilist nation state with the corvée system.
Right. But because of the realization that, number one, first of all, one thing that people don't know is that the mulattoes want to maintain their property status relative to their fathers and inherit their father's land. Dessalines says, hell no, and he nationalizes all the land in the country.
Well, we skipped some steps here, bro.
Okay.
So right after independence, there's a struggle, as Pascal points out, between the interests of the mulatto leadership as to how to constitute the new Haitian nation state. The mulatto elites, of course, their desire is to maintain their pre-revolutionary status, land, everything, slaves, you name it. And the Creole Blacks, who now are at, the reason why Dessalines would remove the importation of Africans is because he realized, hey, at the end of the day, it was the Africans who assist him to defeat the French. So now he made two concessions to the Africans. He got rid of the African slave trade and also the issue of land reform, because remember, the Africans want land. And there's an issue, and Pascal and I have this discussion all of the time. The Africans do not want a nation state similar to the European nation state. For the most part, the African model is an anarchist model. They want what's called the lacus. They want to establish the lacus system in which each Wangan would be in control of their own laku. So these are independent, semi-feudal areas that they would govern. So now there's a struggle between maintaining a mercantilist system, an emerging liberal free trade system, and a lacus system that the Africans wanted to implement. So now there is that between that struggle, Dessalines, and some will argue this is the speech that basically assigns his death warrant. Dessalines, because the mulattoes are arguing that they want to maintain their pre-war status, Dessalines argues, well, what about those whose parents are in Africa? What do they get? And at that moment, Pétion decide he's going to assassinate Dessalines. He appeals to Christophe. Christophe, being the treacherous Negro that he is, he signs off on it.
He signs off and turns the other way. He just turned. He said, "Yo, you do."
Yes.
But before that, he did nationalize the land on the country.
Yes,
the mulattoes,
and the mulattoes were upset about that. Absolutely.
About that. And in that nationalization project, he makes the speech where he says, "I'm going to give land to the Africans," and that's what signs his death warrant. He dies.
Yes.
Christophe takes over the north. The mulattoes go in the south, and they're in a civil war.
Well, once the death of Dessalines is murdered October 18th, 1806, now there's a debate between Christophe and Pétion as to who should govern the island post Dessalines. Pétion realized, because of the African majority, that that they needed a black face to govern Haiti, and hence begins what's called politique des doubles in Haiti. Mm-hmm. Now, what that is the mulattoes
put up a blackface puppet to run the country.
Now, the reason why they would do so, this is very important. Remember, post the independence, majority of nations refused to trade with an African nation.
Right.
So what would happen? The mulattoes served as that intermediary group to allow trade between the Creole Blacks who owned land and produced the raw materials on the island, and they would send their products to the mulattoes, who would then export it onto the global marketplace.
Right. That's why the mulattoes always like to be involved in international trade, because the whites would only recognize them because they didn't want to see any blacks.
They didn't want to see blacks represented, etc. And they remember by 1806. The rest of the world is still enslaved. The rest of the black world is still enslaved. Haiti is the only independent black nation at this time. So now the mulattoes realize that, hey, we need a black face to govern, because we can only control the population with another black face. And they introduced this politique des doubles under Pétion, in which he declares Christophe the president, and he would take a back seat, but he basically neutered Christophe. Christophe had no control over the economy, nothing, and that would be relegated to a Congress, a bicameral legislature that would govern part of that was to basically curtail the black power on the island,
right?
Because majority of the literate group in Haiti at that time were the mulatto elites for the most part. So that starts a civil war between Christophe and Pétion. It's a stalemate. Pétion declares the north his area. And
Christophe takes the north.
Yeah, Christophe takes the north. Pétion takes the west and the south. So That would last until 1825, until Boyer would reunite the island.
Well, someone argue it ends with the death of
Christophe.
The death of Christophe. And Christophe died. What year was that? What year is it?
That's 1821. And then
1821. That's right.
Yeah, and then Boyer would reunite the island.
Right. Boyer would reunite. And Boyer is one of the generals who fought against Toussaint Louverture and also went to France to fight with Napoleon to come back to reinstitute slavery with Leclerc. And now Pétion and him they were both those mulatto generals. These traitors are the ones who are setting the future of the country after Dessalines is assassinated and Christophe dies for the long perpetuity of the country. And that from the assassination of Dessalines, pretty much, it just slowly goes downhill. And from the end and the death of Christophe, the country is all down the hill.
It's downhill from there.
Because they create internal intrigue against the blacks, whether they be Creole and African, and to side with external international actors to undermine the Black Liberation Project because they wanted to engage in trade to enrich themselves.
And what's important, after the death of Dessalines, the majority of the Africans do not trust Christophe and the rest of the generals.
Because they don't do the land reform.
They don't do the land reform. So what happens is the Africans now, they go into the mountains and the provinces of the country, and they instituted their own Lakou system. And from 1806 to contemporary time, the national government has never had complete control over the island of Haiti. The mulattoes were basically, they directed Port-au-Prince and the trade in Port-au-Prince, and the majority of the Haitians were basically left to their own devices to
so it became a battle between the mulattoes and the Creole Blacks for control over the destiny of the Africans and trade and enterprise in the country.
At the expense of the Africans.
Yeah, at the expense of the Africans or the Bourgeois. We are now called the paysans, habitants, and all that other.
Yeah, and I would argue that's been the norm. It's been one civil war after another since the death of Dessalines.
Absolutely. Paul Mocombe, we're coming to the end. This was a great hour and 37 minutes, brother. I hope you feel satisfied. I know you can talk about this. We can go for hours.
Absolutely.
But I believe we're going to wrap this up right now, brother. Thank you for our January 1st Haitian Independence Day show. And we will have you on as a guest sometime in the near future, hopefully with Dr. Lou. Absolutely. And on that note, thank you for watching. This is Revolution Podcast. Haïtien n'a pas tout contrôle le podcast, ça, mon cher. The Haitians take full control of the podcast, and we are out.
Thank you for having me.